Cool. What's going on, guys? Welcome back to the Rizq podcast. Today, we've got a very, very special interview with Asa Winstanley. He's an author, he's a journalist, and most recently, he has been fact checked by Instagram for recent um, his recent piece on the October 7th attacks in Israel. And that was one of the main reasons that I wanted to bring you on, Asa, is to speak about your article that you had written about in terms of the IDF themselves shooting Israelis on that day. And of course, like I mentioned, I actually posted a screenshot of the headline on my Instagram, and that has now been censored by Instagram. So it's no longer being shown at all unless someone's scrolling through my feed. And it's got a little description below saying this has been fact checked and Israel denies this, or something to those words of effect. Now, I just wanted to kind of start at the top there, which is to really uncover and unpack this. So, can I just ask, from your own perspective, what were your thoughts on what happened on October 7th, on the day itself, when it actually happened? What was going through your head on that day?
I actually wasn't aware of what you've just said about the Instagram fact check. Yeah, I wasn't aware that had happened to that. So this was on the post that you made of my article. Is that right?
Yeah, but I took a screenshot, and if you go through my feed, maybe I'll put a screenshot in edit. But if you go through my feed, you'll see the square images of whatever I posted, and on funnily enough, on the screenshot that I took of your article headline, and also of a tweet by George Galloway where he said the same thing, both of those have been censored, so you can't actually see it unless you click into it, and then you click onto it again and then you'll see that it's been censored. It was being shared very widely, so a lot of people were watching it and sharing it, and then all of a sudden, bang! They clamped down on it, censored it, and there's a little disclaimer saying that this has been, proven false. So yeah, I just wanted to get your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, very interesting. Yeah, I mean, this is an example of the kind of censorship that Palestinians have been dealing with for a long time, really. I mean, really, I mean, since 2016, really, and the whole sort of hysteria about alleged fake news that started with Hillary Clinton and all this kind of stuff. There has been, Facebook and other big tech companies started changing their algorithms to restrict alternative media from posting their articles, and it affects us as the Electronic Intifada. Affects lots of other alternative media websites, and Palestinians really have been the canary in the coal mine of this. That they've been facing this kind of severe restrictions and censorship. Facebook, of course, Instagram, of course, is owned by Facebook's parent company, Meta. So yeah, I mean, this kind of censorship is affecting Palestinians really more than anyone else in a lot of ways, and yeah, this is the kind of thing that we have to deal with a lot. So it's not a surprise to hear that it was censored in that way, and they've been doing their best to censor a lot of the news that we've been putting out about this particular story, and just in general of our coverage. So of the genocide in Gaza, and also of the truth about what happened on the 7th of October. There is just some recent examples of censorship that YouTube has been either age restricting or deleting videos that we've posted online about all of this. One example is a few weeks ago, the Israeli state broadcaster Kan published on its social media a really disgusting music video sang by a choir of Israeli school children, in which, I mean, the lyrics were just genocidal. They were outright genocidal. They were saying 1 year later, and there'll be nothing there in Gaza. We will annihilate everyone in Gaza. And this is young. I mean, it's child abuse, really, is what the people behind this is doing, and making these children sing these really disgusting, openly genocidal lyrics. The video, a video got some backlash, and they deleted it pretty quickly. But we made a copy of it. We were the first to translate it into English, and we posted it online. We reposted it on our YouTube channel with subtitles in English, and YouTube have deleted it. They've completely deleted it for for unspecified reasons. They just said it goes against their policies, but it didn't give us any meaningful opportunity to appeal or anything. So it's a big problem. It's an ongoing problem. These big tech companies have got a massive amount of control over what are effectively public squares, and there's no transparency. There's no meaningful right to appeal, and they increasingly have a lot of sway over what we can and can't say. But the video is still up in the article that we have about it. We also published it to Twitter, of X as it's now known. So you can see the video there, but it's just one example of the kind of restrictions we work with. So in terms of 7th of October, well, my response to when it started to happen on the day itself was that this was a prison break, that it was the people of the Gaza ghetto trying to break free, trying to break down the prison walls and escape from the inhumane conditions that has been imposed on them by years and years of genocidal Israeli siege on them, periodic wars every few years, starting really in 2006 and especially in 2008 and 2009. These periodic genocidal wars where thousands and thousands of Palestinians, civilians, are deliberately killed by Israel. And that is the point of these wars. And they even have this genocidal terminology for it. They have all these euphemisms. And just even the euphemism itself is telling of the goals. So for years, it was mowing the lawn, this idea that it's really dehumanizing rhetoric, that Palestinians are not human. There's some sort of weed that has to be mowed back every few years in these bombing campaigns. Now, the latest one we've heard reportedly from Netanyahu himself, the Prime Minister of Israel himself, is that we need to do a population thinning of the Gaza Strip. So the idea is that they seem to think that they're not going to be able to get away with the genocidal war indefinitely to wipe out everyone, but they're going to try and thin the population for as much as possible, for as long as they have a free hand as possible. So this is the state of the Gaza Strip, and people are not going to take it if you try and kill or drive out indigenous people from their land. They're going to rebel against it, and that's what happens every time in history. If you try and wipe out, crush, destroy, oppress, colonize the people of the land, they're going to fight back by any means necessary. That's what they did in North America. That's what the native indigenous people did in North America. They fought back by any means they could. And they're still struggling for their freedom and their existence. That's what they did in South Africa. Nelson Mandela, of course, is hailed worldwide as this hero and peacemaker, and of course he was. But people also forget that as late as 2008, he was regarded formally by the US government as a terrorist, and he had to have every time he went to the United States as the president of South Africa and later statesman, he had to have a special dispensation from the terrorism restrictions in order to travel to the United States until that designation was eventually formally dropped. And that's because he was the leader of the armed wing of the ANC, the forerunner of today's South African armed forces in some ways, or one of the forerunners, you could say. MK, the Spear of the Nation, as it was called. And they did carry out armed attacks against the South African apartheid regime. And there were other forms of armed struggle as well in South Africa. Again, look at Algeria. The Algerians, millions of Algerians were killed by the French colonists during the long, many decades, more than a century of French colonialism in Algeria. And how did they free themselves? They didn't free themselves by appealing to the sensibilities of French politicians. They freed themselves. Yes, there was non-violence used as well, but they freed themselves by a war of national liberation. And the Palestinians are no different. That is the only way they're going to be able to free themselves. Yes, international solidarity can help and can make a difference, but at the end of the day, it's the Palestinians themselves who are going to free themselves. So my response to that was my response to what happened on the 7th of October, and it's still my response now. At the same time as well, what we saw really right away was a lot of mass hysteria, really, in the Israeli and international press, with all kinds of atrocity stories about the alleged crimes of the Palestinian resistance against Israel on the 7th of October. And we've seen some really insane stuff, and a lot of it has really been debunked. Like one of the earliest of these atrocity propaganda stories was the idea, which appeared on the front pages around the world, including on the London Metro, that there were 40 beheaded babies that were found in the kibbutzim that the Palestinian resistance assaulted on 7th of October. And, this story got out across the world and was widely believed. It was a complete lie. It was a complete lie. I mean, we can say that now. It was a complete lie. At the beginning, we said, well, this is unproven. There's no confirmation of this. We said cautious things like that. But by now, we can say it was a lie. It absolutely was a lie. And we know that because even Israel's own official figures, which I have to say, I think there are some doubts over, but even if we take the Israeli government, the Israeli military's figures of the dead, if we take those figures, there is one child, there is one baby that has been killed in the figures. The figures do keep changing, but there's one baby that has been killed. We don't know how that baby died. According to one report I've seen, it was during a crossfire. But this idea that, these savage Palestinians were sort of brutally rampaging through Israeli communities and tried to kill any civilian they could, and whenever they saw them, despite the fact that the Palestinian resistance has a long record of not doing that, of doing the opposite, of targeting military targets. I doubted that from the beginning. But now we know for a fact that was a lie. That was a deliberate propaganda lie that was intentionally intentionally aimed at trying to falsely portray Palestinians as this brutal savages, inhuman murderers, and all this kind of stuff, rapists. This is the classic colonial terminology that is always used against the indigenous people. That's what they said about the North American savages, right? The indigenous people in what is today called North America. They were savages, they were redskins, all this kinds of stuff. Exactly the same terminology was used by the French in Algeria against the Algerian people, that they were savages and they were backwards Muslims and all this kind of stuff. And in China as well, all over the world, wherever European imperialism has imposed itself, they used exactly the same lies and defamation against the people they're trying to occupy.
Yeah, do you know what? It's very, very interesting. Some of the things that you've said there. It opens up to some of the questions that I had for you. So I'll try to order it in the best way that I think possible. So just in terms of the narrative that was painted about, the 40 beheaded babies, and what's crazy is the fact that you had the president of the United States, you have the UK politicians, and you still now to this day have Israeli ministers using these exact figures, 40 dead beheaded babies. I hear it from people like Elon Levy still quoting it, and Mark Regev still quoting it when he's speaking to people like Piers Morgan, who doesn't challenge him on this, who doesn't correct him on this, who doesn't say, that's been debunked or anything. So I find it really, really disheartening, really, to be honest. I mean, that's as much as I can say. It's just disheartening to hear that these people are still lying to their own population and their own people who will listen to them, right? So in terms of the numbers then, so the first number that we heard that came out was 1,400 innocent Israelis were butchered and massacred on that day. What do you know in terms of the figures and whether they were civilians, the mix between civilians and soldiers, and we also have these rape allegations, which, obviously I don't know anybody in Hamas or anything like that, but if they do say that they are, fighting this with Islamic values, I find it hard to believe that they would rape any women or men, because that's one way ticket to hell, right? This is what we call zina, when you have sexual relations outside of a marriage, and especially when it's forced like that. So I find it very difficult to believe that that they would even do that. So what do you know from your research in terms of the figure and the balance between civilians and soldiers, and the manner in which these deaths occurred?
Yeah, good questions. Okay, so there's two main points there to respond to. But first of all, just to briefly say that the two figures just to point out that the two people that you mentioned there, Mark Regev and Elon Levy, are, as you know, Israeli government spokespeople. Mark Regev is the former Israeli ambassador in London, and they're both settlers, is what they are. They're both settlers. Mark Regev is an Australian settler who came to Israel. Elon Levy is a British settler who's gone to Israel, and they've both become two of the most prominent Israeli liars on international TV screens for the Israeli government. And yeah, I mean, it's exactly that's it. I mean, that's exactly the point. That the lies about the 40 beheaded babies were put out by Israeli government. First of all, it was put out by people not official Israeli government spokespeople, but they're outliers, right? They're their own sort of. They put it out there. It gets reported. It's fed to the international press, who are credulous and racist enough to believe these things. They put it on the front page, and then the Israeli government itself regurgitates these lies in their declarations from their official spokespeople, even when they're later debunked by their own figures, by the government's own figures. Okay, so first of all, there's the issue of the death figures, the death toll. Now, I think I said earlier that there's reasons to doubt the official death toll, and the main reason for that, apart from just the Israeli government's long history of lying, is that the figures keep changing. They keep going down. So they started. Okay, so in the early days, they were going up, right? And that's what you would expect, right? If there's been a mass event of some kind and they're still counting dead bodies, the figures would go up, and it would be unclear in the early days. Okay, but pretty soon, after a couple of weeks or so, a few weeks, they settled on this figure of 1,400 dead, right? Now, if you looked at the actual lists of the dead that are released in Israeli media, which you can do quite easily because it's released in English, on several Israeli media websites, Haaretz and Times of Israel both released them in English. If you looked at the list, a lot of those 1,400 alleged dead were actually soldiers. According to their own figures, around about 300 of those, 300, 350 round about there, were either soldiers or police. So military targets in that sense, in the sense that they were armed. And that's not even including Israeli soldier reservists or armed security guards in some way, because what you have to understand about Israeli society is it's incredibly highly militarized, right? I mean, I traveled when I lived in the West Bank on a couple of occasions for various reasons. I unfortunately had to travel through Tel Aviv. And I was actually, I mean, I'd read about it, but I was shocked whenever you see Israelis in public spaces, the number of guns that you just see. I mean, imagine sort of America on speed. It's like, it's insane. Like, people have, shoulder slung rifles everywhere. And also, like, I traveled on public transport, right, in so-called Israel, and the soldiers get transported on public buses. Like, this is how soldiers get around the country. So, when Israel says about, Hamas uses Palestinians as human shields, that's number one, that's not true. But actually, the opposite is true. The Israeli government uses the Israeli civilian population, embeds its own soldiers within the civilian population. I mean, and it's a fact, and it's never talked about. At the headquarters of Israel, the Israeli army itself is in downtown Tel Aviv. Like, it's not in, it's not in some military base separate from it. It's amongst the civilian population, the actual headquarters of it. So, that's an interesting aspect of all this. The Israeli civilian population is very difficult to disentangle from the Israeli military, the Israeli army and air force and so forth. Okay, so it was 14. They said 1,400 at first, but if you actually looked at the figures, a lot of those alleged 1,400 were soldiers and police, even according to their own figures, like active duty. But then that 1,400 figure often got either misunderstood or misrepresented or deliberately twisted by international media into 1,400 civilians were killed by evil Hamas terrorists on 7th of October. That was never true. And then last month, the Israeli government officially reduced their death toll to 1,200. And Mark Regev, who you've already mentioned, came out on media. I forget which channel it was, but possibly Sky News. We at the Electronic Intifada, we did a story about it. And the Israeli government formally said, well, we're reducing the death count to 1,200. And Mark Regev was asked why this was. And he said, well, it turns out there was all these bodies there was about 200 bodies that were incredibly burned. So they were being completely burned up, and we were unable to identify them. We thought they were Israelis. It turns out they were Hamas terrorists. Of course, that's the way he would put it. They were Hamas terrorists. And so, we realized we made a mistake, and we revised the death toll down to 1,200. That's interesting in several regards, which I'll come back to. But the next point is that does seem to have been reduced again to around about 1,000. And again, this had a week or two ago, one of the official Israeli Twitter accounts at Israel, which is run by the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, it put out another tweet which seemed to reduce again to 1,000, and it said that on the 7th of October, about 1,000 of our people were killed by evil Hamas terrorists, or however they framed it. So these death tolls seem to be going down and down. So, how many of those were civilians and how many were military? So if we take it, and it's actually difficult to separate some of this out, because another aspect that's making it more confusing is if you look at the Haaretz list of the dead on their website, they have it's quite a useful database, although it's behind a paywall, and they do separate out soldiers and police from what they say are civilians. Although if you actually look even at the civilians, not all of them are actually civilians, and they do have some of them have got military uniforms and ranks in the names of the dead. But be that as it may, one of the complicating factors now is, since the ground invasion at the end of October of Gaza began, they're actually including in all those figures soldiers that have died in Gaza, that soldiers that have been invading Gaza and have died because Palestinian resistance fighters have been fighting them. So they're muddling together, legitimate military targets with a Hamas massacre, alleged Hamas massacre. And I suppose the other thing that I want to say before we get on to the alleged rapes is that the other big aspect of this, which I think you probably will come on to anyway, is the big question is so if we take, okay, let's say it's the true figure may be around about 1,200 Israeli dead on the 7th of October. Let's just take that for the sake of argument, although it seems to be going down. If that's the case, according to their figures, at least 350 of them were soldiers and police. Okay, of the remaining number, the 900 or so civilians who allegedly died, how many of those were killed by Israel itself? But this is the big unknown. But we know for a fact, we can say for a fact now, that many of them, we don't know how many yet, but many of them were killed by Israeli forces themselves in what they are now saying is friendly fire, that it was accidental, that there were accidental killings and the confusion, and we weren't expecting this attack by Hamas, and there was a chaotic response. I think that is true. I think there was a chaotic response, but there's an even bigger question around this Israeli military doctrine, secretive Israeli military doctrine, the Hannibal Directive. I suppose that's probably your next question. We'll get onto that, but I'll mention about this claim of mass rape first. So to respond to what you said about that, yeah, you're right. Like this is what is being claimed, and again, this is another one of these atrocity stories which has very little basis in evidence. It has no basis in evidence, really. And again, we're just supposed to presume that it happened. So this is the racist standards of the international media. Is, well, of course, Hamas, they're these evil Muslims, evil Palestinians. Of course, they're going to rape people. That is what is presumed. And again, it's exactly the same thing that was said against First Nations people in North America, the indigenous people in North America. They're barbarians, they're rapists. In Algeria, the same thing was said. The same thing was said in the Jim Crow South, right? In the United States about Black people. Emmett Till was killed. It was not that long ago, right? Emmett Till, this young boy who was alleged to have wolf whistled at a white woman. He didn't even do that. The woman, just before she died, admitted that she'd lied about it. And this poor young boy was beaten to death by a gang of white racists. And he, his story then became very famous in the civil rights movement. He was a kind of martyr for that cause. But his story was only one of many. This was the common lie about Black people in the United States, was that they were rapists and so forth. And this was often the justification, the pretext for the lynching of Black men in the Jim Crow South. And we're seeing very similar lies spoken about Palestinians now. And, it's often in explicitly Islamophobic terms, right? Of these barbarian Muslims, they have this backward religion and all these kind of lies. Whereas, as you mentioned, of course, Islam teaches the opposite. And so, I mean, I think if you look, we did an episode of our live stream, a segment of one of our live streams where my colleague Ali Abu Nama got into these allegations in some detail, and you can look that up on our YouTube channel. But I mean, just to say briefly, Ali has been looking into it, and the bottom line is there's no evidence that this happened. There's absolutely no evidence that this happened. If you take there has been some alarming sounding headlines in the international media and in the Israeli media. There's this one long story in Haaretz, which is the leading or one of the leading Israeli daily newspapers from a allegedly liberal perspective, liberal Zionist, which is really a contradiction in terms. But the headline, I forget off the top of my head exactly the wording, but it was something along the lines of, the evidence of Hamas's mass rape campaign against Israelis is growing. And then you read the actual article, and the bottom line is there's no evidence. And they actually say in the article, the people who've been charged with gathering testimonies or gathering evidence of this, or portraying to the international media that there's the evidence of this, actually gathered no testimonies from eyewitnesses. Right? So there's no eyewitness evidence of this happening. There's no woman who said this has happened to me. And yet they have all these disinformation campaigns, mostly on social media in the West, right? There's these weird campaigns about it where they sort of, the hashtag is something like "Me Too unless you're a Jew," which is bizarre, right? They're trying to say that, liberals are against the abuse of women unless they're Jewish. But and that you're supposed to believe women, etc. But there's no women to believe. This is the thing, right? The women being put forward to say these things are really propagandists for the Israeli government, is what it is. And there's no actual evidence of this happening. That's really the bottom line. That's what it comes down to. It has to be said. So, it's really a kind of propaganda shock doctrine, where we're sort of hit on the head with this awful thing happened. There was rape, there was beheading of 40 babies, and do you support that? If obviously, do you condemn Hamas, etc. And people are sort of supposed to be bludgeoned into the head into just going along with the genocide that is happening. And unfortunately, most people are not believing that, and they are continuing to protest against this genocide. And there is increasing pressure being brought to bear on the Israelis internationally, certainly on the popular level.
Yeah, do you know what? It's very interesting because for a long time now, I've kind of understood or tried to learn more about the traits of narcissists, and it seems very much so that the Israeli government are very much narcissistic. And one of the things that narcissists do is they tend to project what's within themselves or what they do.
Yes.
And so, you touched on a couple of points here in terms of they themselves embed themselves within civilian populations. They themselves.
I've seen it with my own eyes. Like it's rarely talked about, but I've seen it.
Yeah, and one of the other things that has really frightened me, more so in some ways than the actual bombings that are going on, is things that Zippy Hotovelia, she mentions this quite a lot, which is Hamas are being the Palestinian children are being taught to be Nazis in schools. They're being taught to be terrorists and to hate Jews and Israelis. And what's interesting about that is that she's saying that, but then at the same time we see pictures dating back to 2006 where you've got literal children writing messages on bombs, and you just have to think, where is the indoctrination coming? And I made a point yesterday on a video that I made, which was that no child is born wanting to harm other children. if,
Right.
if that child is writing a message on a bomb which is going to kill someone, it's only through a process of indoctrinating that child to think that what she's doing and where this bomb is going is for a good reason, right? So that to me
Yeah.
speaks of an indoctrination that is going on. I mean, do you know anything about and the reason why I say that's scary, by the way, is because we can see that there's these kind of concentration camps that are happening in the Uyghurs, for example, right, where they take the children, they take even adults, and they almost brainwash them. The Chinese government will always brainwash them, and give them messaging away from their culture and their beliefs, etc. So do you know anything about that in terms of the Israeli education system, and how Israelis are taught to perceive Palestinians?
Yes, I do. So, I mean, I think the point that you made is exactly right. Israel is the sort of narcissistic. Um, Israel is the sort of narcissistic abuser, right, of the nations, I guess you could say, because I mean, one of the things that has struck me most during this particular war against the civilian population of Gaza, aside from the sheer horror, is just one of the things people have been saying online a lot. Pro-Palestinian people have been saying on social media a lot is, it's become almost a slogan now, is that every Israeli accusation is a confession, right? And this wasn't a new idea to me, but it's come home a lot more to me now, because almost without fail, every practically every heinous crime they falsely accuse the Palestinians of is actually carried out by Israel. Almost everyone that you can think of, and I've been doing this like thought experiment during this time. It works every time. Like every one of these things, 40 beheaded babies. They've beheaded more than 40 babies in the bombing campaign. Definitely, I mean, I've lost count now of how many children have been killed in this bombing campaign. I mean, you look at the graphic videos. I try not to look at them all, to be honest, but you see them, and there are literally beheaded babies. And this happens not just during this war, because it happens during all of these genocidal Israeli wars. Babies are literally beheaded by their bombs. This is what they do. The civilians are the targets. Rape. This is not talked about very much because it is difficult for survivors to talk about it. But women and men, Palestinian women and men in Israeli jails, are sexually assaulted and raped. It happens habitually. I mean, I've read accounts of it. Obviously, it's hard for the survivors of this to talk about it in detail, and I wouldn't really want to read that anyway. But I have read accounts of this for years, in these kinds of things, all kinds of torture and abuse happening in Israeli jails. It's incredibly well documented in English by Palestinian human rights groups like Adamir, the Prisoners' Rights Association. There was a book that was put out by Pluto Press about the abuse of Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails some years ago, but it's only escalated during this war. And I think at least 6 Palestinians now have died in Israeli custody during this particular war in the West Bank, right? In the West Bank and within so-called Israel, the prisons there. So the most horrific torture and abuse as well. The targeting of civilians, we've already mentioned the human shields and the embedding of the military within the civilian population. So, the opposite is true. And I think this is a really deep psychological phenomenon of the settler colonial society. And for this kind of reasons and psychology behind this, you have to read things like Frantz Fanon in Wretched of the Earth, where he talks about the colonizer projecting their insecurities on to the colonized, onto the indigenous. Israel Israel does impose these things. It does impose its own psychoses in this way. I'm sorry, I think I got a bit off track there. I was on a
No,
bit of
no,
a
no.
tangent. What was the original question?
No, I mean it was exactly that. It was just to the effect of do you have any understanding of how the
Right,
how children are taught? Yeah, like, for example, that child who's writing a message on the bomb, one can
right.
only imagine that she's heard stories and tales and taught and socialized into thinking a certain way about the Palestinians. So, do you know anything about that aspect of their education system?
Yes. Yeah, this is an excellent question. Again, this is another case of projection. So they always, Israeli spokespeople, propagandists, and Zionists in the West are always saying how Palestinians teach their children to hate, and that now has reached genocidal proportions where the Israelis are just saying that there's no innocent people in Gaza and that they're all a military target. They're just openly saying it, that they are a military target, etc. Whereas the opposite is true, that Israel as a society does indoctrinate children. Now, we Palestinians and, us in the Palestinian solidarity movement are different from the occupiers. We're not like the Zionists. We do not think Israeli children are therefore military targets. Absolutely not. We don't want we don't want Israeli children to be killed. And but the reality is, if you look at Israeli society, it is highly, highly militarized from an early age. Of course, everybody, men and women, are supposed to have compulsory military service when they're a teenager, starting at 18. Not a lot of people know this, but actually, the figures of that, it's technically compulsory, but most people actually get out of it. And not for political reasons for the most part, right? There is a few Israeli dissidents, very, very small number of Israeli dissidents who refuse military service on principle, and they then go to jail for that. They don't spend very long in jail. But they nonetheless they would suffer for that. So that's good that they do that. But they're a very, very small, practically insignificant minority of Israeli society, unfortunately. But for the most part, I believe the figure is it's as high as around as low as around 45%. That only around 45% of Israelis actually do allegedly compulsory military service in the military, and it is quite easy for them to get out of that service. And the reason for that is that there's all kinds of exemptions, right? So there's for the very religious, there is the religious exemption, although that's being kind of eroded. But for the most part, it's apolitical people who just want to have like a sort of easy life in Tel Aviv or wherever it is, and they can get like a sort of mental health exemption, or they can just find some reason why. Well, speaking of Israeli dissidents, I knew one Israeli dissident who was genuinely pro-Palestinian guy, anti-Zionist. I won't name him, but he he said that I mean, what he told me was that so he didn't want to go to prison by saying, look, I'm not going to serve in your army. I also didn't want to lie and sort of say, oh yeah, no, I'm feeling really, crazy, I'm not going to do. And so he just said, no, I'm with the other side, so I'm gonna, like, you don't know what I'm gonna do. You don't want me. you don't want me. You don't want me joining the army. So they were like, okay, bye. So yeah, I mean, another dissident Israeli, Shir Hever, who's written some very good books on the Israeli economy and so forth. We did a podcast with him a few years ago, and he brought out these figures of the enrollment. It's quite interesting, actually. and the Israeli military actually kind of suppresses this information. The last time they took this kind of information quite a few years ago, it was very, very low, the number of enrollment. I mean, it probably has gone up during the current war, right, because of all the information against the disinformation against the Palestinians. But nonetheless, the point of all that I'm getting at here is Israel is a very, very militarized society, right? It's a settler colonial society. If you think of a sort of combination of North America during the Wild West era, right, with the siege mentality of apartheid South Africa and Rhodesia, which was even worse than apartheid South Africa in a lot of ways, all wrapped up into this horrific monstrosity of a state called Israel, and then add nuclear weapons to the mix. This is the kind of siege mentality that they have, right? And so it's in order to keep on this monstrosity and to keep on just killing people, you have to have a highly, highly militarized society. And so the allegedly compulsory military enrollment starts at 18, but before that they have these kinds of military scout camps for high school students who, to prepare them for life in the Israeli army and so forth. And these quite often recruit Western supporters. They have various programs where they kind of enroll Zionists from around the world. And there is, as well, if you look at the educational system, the Israeli educational system, it does teach Israelis to hate, does teach Israeli students, Israeli children to hate Palestinians from an early age. And this is we're talking about the national school system, and we're not even talking about religious schools of some of the settler extremists and so forth, which is just outright genocidal. But there was a very good book written in I believe it was 2012. I published a review of it in 2012 on the Electronic Intifada. I mean, I'll send you the link. Maybe you can put it up on the screen in the edit. But
sure.
It's written by an Israeli dissident historian called Nurit Peled Al-Hanan, the sister of Miko Peled, very famous former Israeli and an anti-Zionist activist who's done some really great work. But Nurit Peled Al-Hanan, she wrote this great book called Palestine in Israeli School Books. And she goes through Israeli textbooks quite systematically, and she shows just basically the propaganda and the hate that is taught in these official government-approved textbooks, right, to Palestinian, to Israelis' school children, and that all this kind of racist stuff that Israelis are brought up with, and all that kind of stuff. So and this is really it. The book was kind of a response to the propaganda that was really deployed against Palestinians really from the late 90s until today, that there's this recurring trope about, Palestinian textbooks teach Palestinians to hate Jews and all this kind of lies. It's not true. I mean, I can't help thinking right now of my my late friend and colleague Rifat Al-Ariya, the Palestinian poet, a writer, and academic at the Islamic University of Gaza, which was destroyed in this bombing campaign. He was killed by Israel, and it was a great loss to us, to all of us who knew him, but especially to all his former pupils and mentees in Gaza. He was a professor of English literature, and he wrote better poetry than I ever could in a second language, right? It was amazing. You read his poems now, and he taught humanism, like he taught human respect, universal human respect to his students, and he taught his students to not hate Jews and to not be like the other side, to not to descend to their level, and to even there's an amazing poem that he wrote called "I Am You," which is, I'm not going to do it justice in describing it. I mean, people can look it up. Rifat Al-Ariya, "I Am You." You can just search for it online, and the way, I mean, poetry is subjective, right? But the way I interpret it, it's through the eyes of a Palestinian who has been beaten to death or tortured by an Israeli soldier with a rifle butt, and the Palestinian is trying to appeal to the humanity of his oppressor and to the history of the European oppression of the Jews and of the memory of the Holocaust. And it's done, the poem is done in such a unique way. He's trying to appeal to the humanity of his oppressor despite the oppressor's inhumanity against him. And he's not doing it in a way that is undignified and simpering, right? He's just saying the stark fact of, whether you like it or not, I am you. We're all humans, and you are killing the humanity inside yourself by killing me. I'm not doing it justice by a long shot, but the point is here that he was killed in a targeted assassination by the Israelis because he was famous internationally. He wrote in English. He raised an army of writers in Gaza who were writing and still write in English. We publish many of them today on our website, electronicintifada.net. And this was what Rifat did was a massive blow to Israeli propaganda the world over. It really destroyed their propaganda. And because of that, he was targeted. And he did the opposite of what they claim Palestinians. He taught the opposite. He taught humanity, and he taught the parallels between the Palestinian struggle for freedom and other struggles for freedom, the Black struggle for freedom in North America, and the struggle against anti-Jewish prejudice in Europe against the Holocaust. And so he taught those parallels, and he taught this universal message. Yeah, we miss Rifat a lot. And the point is that Israel is the one who teaches their children to hate. The Palestinians teach life.
Yeah, I was at a Speaker's Corner maybe about 5 or 6 weeks ago, and was in a conversation about this conflict with Muslims and non-Muslims, including some atheists, and one chap came up behind me, and once the conversation had died down a little bit, he said, "What do you think the solution would be?" And I said, my personal opinion is that it should go back to being the state of Palestine. And he said, "What about the Jews?" I said, "The Jews, of course, would live there like they lived there before, and everyone would have equal rights, and there would be no issue." Now that's just my own personal thoughts, but he was shocked when I said to him my response about what about the Jews. In my head, there's no difference, right? There's no difference between a Muslim or a Jew or a Christian or an atheist or a Hindu, but there's no difference, right? And there was a tweet that I saw the other day, which someone had done a survey of Israelis and Palestinians, and they asked the Israelis the same question: "What do you think should be the future?" And the Israelis and the Palestinians both unequivocally said the same thing, which was there should be one state. However, the difference lied in the following words after that, which was that for the Israelis, they believe that there should be only one state of Israel and all Palestinians should be removed. Whereas the Palestinians said there should be one state and everyone should have equal rights. So it kind of echoed the same thing that I was saying and what I felt as well, which was, I felt very tantamount and true to what you've just spoken about as well. And thank you for sharing even just sharing his name, Rifat Al-Ariya, because I did a quick search on him, and to be honest, it's a very, very, it's almost haunting and chilling to see that he wrote a poem on November 1st, saying, "If I must die, let it be a tale." The last few lines of that are, "If I must die, let it bring hope, let it be a tale." So I really do hope that we can spread his name a bit more, and if anybody's listening to this
Yeah.
who hasn't heard of him, I hope that they do go and look up his poetry, because it's what was this guy a terrorist, really? Was he Hamas, or was he the Shield, or what was he, right? So it's very, very sad to hear that. And obviously, as someone who was your friend, I'm sorry for your loss, of a dear friend of yours, especially someone who's got such a beautiful mind like that. um so yeah. So I don't know if there's anything that you want to touch upon that before I move on to the next question. But actually, the next question is not one that I had prepared, but you did mention it, thinking that I would say it. So I feel a bit embarrassed that I didn't have it written, and I would like you
Okay.
to, and I'd like you to kind of expand on it a bit more, because
Sure.
clearly it is something that must be important, which is the Hannibal doctrine. So, just firstly, if there's anything you wanted to share based on what I said about Rifat, and then obviously if you can move on to the Hannibal doctrine, and your thoughts on this, the importance of this, and any knowledge that we should know about it.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for that. Well, to say about the other thing about the incident at Speaker's Corner, I mean, the fact that this man was shocked by what you said is a kind of testament to how successful Israeli propaganda has been for many years in the Western media. Although, I mean, I think it is lessening now in terms of mass acceptance, but certainly perhaps with an older generation, Israeli propaganda has been quite successful. But it's about more than Israeli propaganda, right? It relates to what I said earlier, right, about the hundreds of years of British colonialism, European colonialism, and indoctrination of us, especially of white people, people in the West who, have all these kind of brainwashed ideas about the other, whether it was in the past Jews, and now it's really Muslims who are seen as the prime enemy other within the Western imagination, and the fact that it was shocking to this man that you would think that. I mean, it's good that you managed to kind of burst this bubble of propaganda just with that one statement. But this is not a new idea, right? This was the position of the PLO, right? Going back to the Palestine Liberation Organization of Yasser Arafat, George Habash, and the other Palestinian resistance leaders of the time, from the mid '60s, was that there should be one democratic state between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea, with equal rights for everybody, regardless of being Jewish, Muslim, Christian, or anything else. That even the settler population, the invaders who arrived since the 1948, should be allowed to stay and have equal rights. And Hamas too. Hamas is not part of the PLO, but they have a very similar position. They have the same position, really. I mean, if you look at their most recent statements, that's absolutely what they say. Their new charter in 2017 makes this very clear, and they say that their struggle and their problem has never been with Jewish people or the Jewish religion, and that it is against Zionism as an ideology, as an invading ideology, and as a material reality of colonialism. And even the founder of Hamas, many years prior to 2017, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, made very similar statements, and this has always been the position of Hamas's leadership. So, okay, so to move on to the Hannibal doctrine, it's really interesting, right? So, in the 1990s, we don't know exactly when, because it was a secret doctrine. It was in the 1990s, roughly 30 years ago. The Israeli military initiated and developed a secretive military doctrine titled the Hannibal Directive. Now, it is named after Hannibal, who was this Carthaginian general who people will probably know from history books as the man who supposedly rode elephants across the Alps in his war against the Romans. He was from Carthagena, right, which is a former state in North Africa, what is now North Africa. And there was this famous series of wars called the Punic Wars between the Romans and the Carthaginians. But the salient point is, in the end, he was about to be captured by the Romans. And the tale that's told in the history books is that Hannibal poisoned himself rather than be captured alive by the Romans. And so the Israelis took this as a military doctrine, that we would rather have our soldiers dead than be captured alive by Lebanese Arab resistance fighters. Because at the time, of course, in the 90s, the Israelis were still occupying most of South Lebanon, and they were fighting a counterinsurgency war against the Lebanese resistance, led by Hezbollah, the Party of God. And Hezbollah was ultimately successful in 2000 in driving the Israeli army and its collaborators out of South Lebanon. Or most of South Lebanon, has to be said. There's still a few small parcels of land there that are still occupied by the Israelis. But the point is this: during this counterinsurgency war, this war of resistance against the Israeli invaders, the Lebanese resistance managed to capture several Israeli soldiers alive. And in that so in order to release these Israeli prisoners alive, the Israelis were forced into making a prisoner exchange with the Lebanese and the Palestinian resistance in South Lebanon. And there were prisoners released from the resistance in exchange for these Israeli soldiers. And this was deeply unpopular amongst the Israeli military establishment for obvious reasons, but it was forced on them because there was no other way to release their prisoners. And so in response to that, they in secret, they developed this military doctrine, the Hannibal Directive, whereby it was permissible that for Israeli armed forces, if they can see their soldiers are going to be captured and there is no other option of preventing them from being captured, you're allowed to use terminal force against the whole area in order to prevent the soldier being captured, even at the cost of the soldier's life. So essentially, in a nutshell, the doctrine is a mealy-mouthed way of saying you're allowed to kill your own soldiers rather than letting them be captured. And there's a reason for this doctrine, because these exchanges were successful. And the biggest one was there were several, right? But the biggest one was in 2011. The Palestinians in the Gaza Strip during the assault on the Gaza Strip in 2006, during the war in Lebanon, the Palestinian resistance managed to capture a soldier. His name was Gilad Shalit. They captured him alive. They kept him in secret, in tunnels, wherever they kept him in the Gaza Strip. They kept him for 6 years, and eventually Israel was forced to negotiate for his release. He was one soldier. He wasn't even a senior officer. He was a private, like he's the lowest level soldier, right? He was a tank commander. He was taking part in the artillery bombardment of the Gaza Strip. Valid military target. He was captured alive. Israel was forced to negotiate for his exchange. In order to release this one soldier, the Israelis were forced to release 1,027 Palestinian prisoners. Now, if you think now, the Palestinian resistance currently has, we're not sure the exact figures, but at least around about 120 Israeli soldiers, Israelis in captivity in the Gaza Strip. Now, it's unclear, but it's thought that, according to the Israelis, according to figures I've seen, around about 20 to 30 of those are probably soldiers. It could be more, right? So if we say it's 20, and if we say they're all privates, which they're not. Some of them are very senior Israeli army officers, including a brigadier general, which is huge. But let's just say, for the sake of argument, that is, let's say it's 20 privates, just for the sake of argument. Theoretically, that's enough to release 20,000 Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. And so that is enough to, even with all the new arrests, new kidnappings, I should say, of Palestinians by the Israeli army thugs that have taken place in the West Bank and Gaza since 7th of October, that prisoner exchange is enough to empty Israel's jails of all Palestinian hostages, including some very senior Palestinian resistance leaders, such as Marwan Barghouti and Ahmed Sadat, the leader of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Marwan Barghouti being a very influential Fatah leader, who's thought to be a kind of successor to Yasser Arafat. So, that is the reason for this doctrine. This is a real doctrine. And the reason we know about it, despite the fact that it was initially secret, is that it was exposed in 2014 during the war on Gaza, the 51-day war against Gaza that took place in 2014, in the summer of 2014. And what happened there was, when these Israelis were invading Shujaiya, east of Gaza City, which they've annihilated again. They've done some really genocidal bombardment there, but at the same time, the resistance has been really punishing them quite heavily there. But during that assault in 2014, there was an Israeli soldier, Haydar Goldin, who was captured by the Palestinian resistance. And we know that the Hannibal Doctrine was activated there, and when they heard that this soldier was captured, they bombarded the whole area. They killed the soldier, but the resistance still managed to keep his body, and they've been negotiating ever since for the release of the body back to Israel, because they also remains as well in these prisoner exchanges also get negotiated for. So that really, 2014 was when the Hannibal Doctrine was exposed in the Israeli and international media. So we know it exists. We know it's a fact. There's debate over whether it allows, the exact proportions of it, and Israel has tried to sort of downplay it. And a few years ago, Israeli media headlines claimed that the doctrine had been rescinded. But if you actually read those media reports, what they actually said, if you read the actual details of what was being said by Israeli military spokespeople, was they said the way the doctrine has been interpreted has been cancelled, but it hasn't been cancelled. It was very shady the way they were operating. They were saying it. But the reality is that since the 7th of October, the reality on the ground is there is every sign that the Hannibal Doctrine has not only been reactivated, but possibly, and I think very likely, has actually been extended to Israeli civilians. That Israeli civilians who were captured on the 7th of October by Palestinian resistance fighters were possibly deliberately targeted by Israel, and certainly killed by Israel during the course of their response to the Palestinian resistance assault. And we know this from lots of evidence. That the article, I mean, we've been covering this in some detail now for the past 2.5 months at the Electronic Intifada. The article of mine that you mentioned at the beginning is the latest confirmation. Like there was Israeli. There's so much evidence of this. Like it's hard to go through it all. The article that I wrote was just the latest article I wrote was just it was just a re-reporting of an Israeli media story in Ynet, and is a mainstream Israeli press source, in which they said that, and the article was not by some Israeli dissident. The article was by the military correspondent of Ynet, which is the website of Yediot Ahronot, which is one of Israel's main tabloid newspapers, if not it used to be the most popular. I think it might be the second most popular, but nonetheless, this is a military reporter with military sources within the high levels of the Israeli military. He's not anti-Israeli military by any stretch of the imagination. And his name's Yoav Zaytoun, and what he said was, they were friendly. It was buried in the penultimate paragraph of the article, but nonetheless, it's there in black and white. He said there were friendly fire incidents on the 7th of October, but there was such what they call an immense and complex number of these incidents that we're not going to investigate them because it would be immoral to do so. And really, that was not the exact words of the Israeli military, but that's this report, the military correspondent's words based on his interviews in the article with Israeli military spokespeople. So this is their thinking. And this response comes because internal to Israeli society at the moment, they're facing great pressure from the relatives of the Israeli citizens and soldiers captive in the Gaza Strip at the moment. Their relatives are trying to free them, and they're putting pressure on the Israeli government to do a prisoner exchange deal. And it would have to be, what's being talked about is what they're saying is an all-for-all deal, which, as I mentioned, that the whole of the Palestinian prisoner population could be released in exchange for the Palestinians in Israeli, in exchange for the Israelis in Palestinian captivity. And so this kind of response, it shows that there is now a scrambling to kind of control the narrative of the of this information, to try and stop this information coming out about Israel having killed Israelis on the 7th of October. And there is every indication that, some of this, yes, it may have just been the confusion of the attack and a confused, chaotic response, but there are increasing indications that at least some of it may have been deliberate matter of policy. If not, it may have come from the top. If it didn't come from the top, it may have come from the initiative of individual soldiers, tank commanders, helicopter pilots. There's massive evidence that a massive number of Israeli cars, civilian cars, specifically from the supernova rave that was taking place near the Gaza Strip, were targeted by Israeli helicopter bombing, by Hellfire missiles, and by their machine gunning. We've seen all this footage again, the Israeli army's own footage of these cars that are being bombed out with completely burned out corpses, and this green, heat sensitive Israeli cameras where it's very blurry, but you can still see that there's civilian cars being bombarded by Israeli Apache helicopters. Now, what's claimed is that these videos show, they say that we're attacking Hamas terrorists on the 7th of October. Well, what was happening on the 7th of October? Palestinian fighters came in to the Gaza frontier settlements in so-called Israel. They captured Israelis, and then they drove them back to Gaza. So those captive Israelis were being bombed by Israeli helicopters because they were all mixed together. And there's accounts showing that there was accounts in the Israeli press showing that they did this. And there was also a story I did not that long ago showing that, again, in the Hebrew media, only in Hebrew, a senior Israeli Air Force colonel actually described what happened on the 7th of October as, quote, a mass Hannibal, and confirming that the Hannibal he confirmed the Hannibal doctrine was activated on that day. And they kind of control the narrative a bit by sort of saying, well, it wasn't intentional and it was an accident. I think a lot of what happened on 7th of October is still unknown, and that it's hard to separate the truth from the lies, especially with a state like Israel, which lies so much. And what is really needed is an independent international investigation, which is something Israel does not want to see.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I find, um, and again, I think I've understood what irony really means through this, because I always want to say, oh, it's funny, but actually it's not funny at all. So then that's where I think irony is the right word to use, which is, for example, when Mark Regev was being asked by Piers Morgan about the 8-year-old boy who was shot dead by IDF soldiers in the West Bank, a few weeks ago, he said, I'm sorry, I don't have any information about that. And yet he has all the information about the evil Hamas terrorists and what they're doing, but he has no information about what IDF are doing. The other day when he was being questioned, and I have to say it was the first time I've actually seen Piers Morgan put any pressure on to any of the Israeli ministers that have come on, or anyone who's pro-Israeli. When he was asked about the and funnily enough, it was only, I guess it's only because it was a Christian who was killed. When it was Muslims, they didn't really care too much. But when the mother and the daughter were shot by snipers outside the church, by the IDF snipers, Piers Morgan was putting pressure onto Mark Regev, who was saying, we don't know, we need to do an investigation. And he'd also said that, they weren't taken off of active duty because we need to do an investigation, which was really ironic, because it's like, well, you started this attack on 8th of October with all these facts about the 40 dead babies, and you've killed over 20,000 Palestinians, and where is the investigation going on with that, right? And then I think it was yesterday on LBC, the mayor of Jerusalem, um,
Yeah,
within about 10 seconds said, I read the report and there are no Christians in Gaza. And then when when the interviewer said, that, no, the Archbishop of Jerusalem has confirmed this, he said, well, I've not read the report, I've not seen the report.
yeah.
Within about 10 seconds, she kind of went from one side to the other. So I
Yeah,
think
I saw that clip. I mean, she was the deputy mayor of Jerusalem. Her name is Fleur Hassan Nahum. Again, actually, she's a British settler who's, become, who's chosen to come and invade Palestine and become a settler in occupied Palestine. And she is just lying through her teeth on British national radio, on LBC, and Nick Ferrari is kind of, I mean, he's very pro-Israel himself, and he's kind of embarrassed about how crude her propaganda is. Yeah, I saw that clip, and it was really kind of funny, in a disgusting way, how she did go from saying, "Oh yeah, I saw the reports. I don't know who these people are. There's no Christians in Gaza." A complete lie, an absolute lie. Um, you know, not only are there Christians in Gaza, actually, people forget this, but Hamas was the elected government of the Palestinian Authority in 2006, and when they came to power, I mean, they were overthrown, in a coup, by the Israel and its collaborators, essentially, is what happened. Without getting into that whole history, but Hamas formed they were very open to forming a coalition government. They invited Fatah, the competitors, into a coalition government. They refused because they wanted to depose Hamas, which they did do in the West Bank. But an interesting little fact is that in that initial Hamas-led government, there was a Christian minister. There was a Christian minister of tourism. I forget his name now, but Hamas's position has never been anti-Christian in any way. It's what you mentioned. There's always been this, going back to the origins of Islam and throughout the whole Crusader period, even when Christians were waging what they call, alleged Christians, what European Christians were waging what they call the holy war against the so-called infidels in Palestine. The Muslim and Arab forces were never anti-Christian or anti-Jewish. It was the opposite. It was about resisting the invasion of the European occupiers. That's what it was about. And so, these kind of lies that Israel has always kind of, it shows how Zionism is a real sectarian ideology, right? She's just lying through her teeth. But I mean, yes, of course, there's Christians in Gaza. I mean, there's Christians all over Palestine. Palestine is, the cradle of Christianity. It's where Christianity was born, right? And so there's always been Christians in Palestine. You know, a minority now. You know, most people converted to Islam. But that's what happens in history, right? People change religions. It happens. It progresses through history. Things like that happen. You know, so she's just lying. Is an utter lie. But that, you're right. That was really funny how she started off saying, "Oh yeah, oh, I saw the reports," and then, you know, she was confronted with her lies, and she said, "Oh no, I didn't see the report."
Yeah, I was just like, this is so cringe, and you know, I really wanted, you know, and I've not actually seen anyone in, you know, even Navarra Media spoke about it. They didn't really pinpoint on that. It was within like 10 or 15 seconds she went from I read the report to I've not read the report. I was just like, oh my god, like. But what I thought was also funny as well was on Twitter, and I'll send you the screenshot of it, which was that I'm not sure on the gentleman's name, but it was someone who had posted that, you know, just remember that Jesus was a Palestinian man when you're celebrating Christmas, right? And the the official Israel Twitter responded to that, and they'd done have you seen this? They did a Google search saying what ethnicity was Jesus, and it says that, you know, he was a Jewish man who was born in Palestine, formerly Palestine, which is now northern Israel, and they posted that very like, you know, proudly, and then someone else would respond to that saying, "Oh, that was an own goal, wasn't it?" Because, you know, even the Google search is saying that he was born in Palestine, but they just can't seem to get it through their head, and they seem to conflate Judaism with Zionism, and, you know, I think this kind
it's deliberate. It's deliberate. Like, you know, Zionism has always been a sectarian ideology. It's always been an anti-Jewish ideology, really. I mean, if you think about, yes, it's Jewish supremacist, but it's also anti-Jewish in a sense that the majority of the Jewish population prior to World War II around the world were anti-Zionist. They opposed Zionism either for religious or just humanist reasons. And it was really only the collaboration of the British Empire and now really the American Empire with the Zionist movement that has given it this superiority over the world's Jewish population, although there's still a vast number of Jews around the world who are absolutely opposed to Israel. And so, yeah, I mean, it just shows. I mean, Zionist is anti-Semitic in the sense that it tries to conflate Israel with Jewish populations around the world, right? And say that the world's Jews are responsible for Israel's crimes. I mean, but what is more anti-Semitic than that, right? So yeah, I mean, they portray this kind of sectarianism, and this is why. I mean, this is the old classic divide and rule game of the colonialists. You know, it's what they try to do everywhere. You know, they tried to do it in India by pitting Muslims against Hindus, right? The British Empire did, and the French colonialists. I mean, the whole reason Lebanon was set up in the first place was to try and create a sectarian Christian state to carve it out of Syria, right? But that failed in the long run. But you know, there hasn't. But these kind of strategies are all they have is really hatred and division, and in the long run, this is not something that is going to succeed.
Yeah, I'm conscious of that. I've taken double the amount of time that I said I would from you, but I just had a couple of questions that I wanted to pose. So I'll pose them together. Firstly, just for context, you yourself, if you don't mind me asking, are you Jewish?
No.
Okay, all right. So that explains one aspect of the question, which was because I've seen your name being posed and written about a lot in the Jewish Chronicle as someone who attacks Israel, and you mentioned that you know, you lived some time in Palestine as well. So I thought I'd just clarify on that. But what I wanted to ask then, in terms of, I guess the last question that I have then is, yeah, kind of putting them together. You know, you've even written a book about weaponizing anti-Semitism, and I've not seen that in a more clear way than when Netanyahu did a speech a couple of weeks ago where he was saying, the ICC are investigating us for war crimes. That's pure anti-Semitism. And I was like, hold on a second. What? How is that? And I made a video about this where I said that the Jewish people should stand up against what he has just said there, because what's going to happen is the term anti-Semitism will start to fall onto deaf ears, because when a Jewish man walks down the street or a woman walks down the street and they are abused for being Jewish, which is anti-Semit, and that is true anti-Semitism, it's almost going to be a bit like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, when they keep hearing the Israelis talk about, don't question us. I mean, even when they're questioned by people about what they're doing, the bombings, that's anti-Semitic. Don't question, that's anti-Semitic. I find that really disheartening, and I feel sorry.
No, I mean, I agree with you, and I think this is already happening. This is the thing. There may have been examples of this happening already. I didn't see the details of it particularly, but there was this case recently of a menorah in North London being vandalized. I mean, I don't know what happened there with that, but but at the same time, Israeli soldiers invading Gaza at the moment are literally taking huge menorahs with them into Gaza, literally huge iron cast menorahs, and planting them in the ground in the rubble of destroyed homes as a symbol of conquest. So what is that saying? They're twisting and debasing Judaism as a religion or as an identity, however they want to term it. They're debasing it from a religious and however people want to understand Judaism or Jewish identity. I'm not bothered. That's fine. But when it becomes a military colonial symbol, then you can see people are not going to be very happy about that. And then this spillover then could then possibly happen, where people are misunderstanding and confusing Zionism with Judaism. And the leading force doing that in the world today is Israel, and that's not a confusion. It's a deliberate strategy on their part. A few years, a number of years ago now in France, when there was those terrible attacks against the Jewish population in France by whoever it was. I can't remember now whether it was Al Qaeda or ISIS, one of these groups which claims to be Muslim but is not. But they. Benjamin Netanyahu tried to take advantage of that situation, and he visited a synagogue I believe it was in Paris, and he gave a speech to them, and he said, "I've come here as your prime minister." Your prime minister. Now, these weren't Israelis; these were French Jewish citizens, and he is claiming to be their prime minister because that's what they claim. Israel is the state of all the Jews. Now, the Jewish people in that synagogue weren't happy with that, and they started singing the Marseillaise, the French national anthem. And so, this is the problem that Israel, and this is what I mean by when I said earlier that Zionism is anti-Semitism, because it does deliberately create this conflation, which could then, cause these situations where people. A small minority of people, has to be said, but these kind of things could happen where people unfortunately get confused in this way.
Yeah, absolutely. Asa, it's been honestly very, very enlightening. I've learned so much from speaking to you, and I hope that this is the first of many. I say the first of many in I hope that this will be the first of many conversations that we have, but the last one we have in terms of this genocide that's going on, because I really do hope that, this stops. Ironically, 40 minutes after BP announced that they were turning their ships around, Rishi Sunak called for a ceasefire. So, hopefully,
Well, it's interesting. I mean, they're using this really deceptive language where he and then he was quickly joined by Keir Starmer.
Yeah.
They've said sustainable ceasefire, which sounds okay, great. Let's have a ceasefire. But when you look at the detail of it, they're kind of lying, and they're saying, well, it has to be a ceasefire without Hamas, which is not going to happen. But you know, then you could. It's if not a step in the right direction, you can tell they're feeling the pressure at least. And the Yemeni armed forces forcing the the oil tankers to turn around from the Red Sea is the kind of ethical naval sanctions we need, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Asa, thank you so much for your time, man. I really, really appreciate it. And yeah, I hope that people benefited from this. And do send me any links that you want me to put in the description for Electronic Intifada, for etc.
I've sent you I've sent you a link in the chat of that Nurik Peled El Hanan book
Cool.
that I mentioned earlier. And if people want to keep up with all my work, they can subscribe to my email newsletter. There's free or paid options. It's asawinstanley.substack.com. Everything I publish, I republish there. There's also original content there. My main outlet is electronicintifada.net. And I also have a book that you mentioned, Weaponizing Anti-Semitism, How the Israel Lobby Took Down Jeremy Corbyn. Maybe I can come back another time to talk about that specifically. Don't have the time now, but
I would love to speak to you about that, actually, because just to kind of put a little cap on this, I remember I was working for a company at one point, which I can't name because we went through a legal case because of racism. The individual that I was working for there, actually, at the time that Jeremy Corbyn was removed from the Labour Party, he was coming up to me to tell me that, you shouldn't support, this is so good that Jeremy Corbyn's been removed, he was Hamas, and I was just like, oh my god, this guy's an absolute tool. So the fact that I saw that you'd written a book about this, I think it would be good to dive into that. And truly, I think he's probably the last politician that we have left that actually represents good moral values, good moral British values that we should probably stick to. So yeah, I would love to have that conversation with you at some point.
Great. All right. Well, thanks for having me.
No, pleasure. Thanks, Asa. Appreciate it.